Okay, Natalie, I'm going to leave it unmuted now. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Can you hear me now still? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So we're ready to go. How you guys feeling about this?
It's fine.
Okay. I think we're good.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and jump on because I just started live streaming it.
All right.
Everybody ready on that end?
Wait till she can talk about you.
All right. Welcome. Glad you could join us for the in-person and online tonight for our spoken history program on the history of the world's largest red barn. And if this is the first time that you're joining us, we're glad that you're here. Spoken History is a collaborative effort of the Northwood County Historical Society, the Marshfield Historical Preservation Association, the City of Marshfield Historic Preservation Committee, the Marshfield Area Genealogy Group, and the Everett Roehl Marshfield Public Library. So there's a lot of us behind this. My name is Natalie Cruz, and I work here at the Marshfield Public Library, and I'll be helping to connect our online viewers with our speakers and the other in-person people, our guests here that are at our library right now watching this. And I will kind of help here via the Zoom webinar. So for those of you watching online, you will notice that your cameras are off and your microphones are muted, and that's how it should be. But you're going to be able to see and hear our speakers tonight. There is a Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your screen that if you have any questions that you think of during the presentation, you can jot those down. And at the end of the presentation, if we could all hold our questions till the end, then the in-person people can ask their questions, and then I'll go ahead and say what the people who are online have written and their questions and their comments. You can also put it in the chat if you'd rather do that. Yeah, we'll do that at the end of it. We also have tonight that a replica of the world's largest round barn, and it was built by Mr. Bill Haas. And I don't know if you can see this book here, but he let us see this book tonight. And now the book is kind of cute. It's called The World's Smallest, World's Largest Round Barn. But he built an exact replica of the world's largest round barn. It has little cows in it and everything. It's so cute. And he's going to let it stay at the library here till I think early Saturday morning or something. So that is on our second floor of the Marshfield Public Library. And it's just really awesome. He's even left part of it open, and you can see inside the round barn and everything. It's really great. It's in kind of a enclosed case and everything. So if you are in the area, stop by and take a peek at that on our second floor. And we'll get started here. We have two speakers tonight, and they're in the Felker room. So we've got quite a crowd in there. Then we also have a few people here online who are watching this. It is being live streamed. So if you know of somebody who'd be interested in looking at this at a later time, they can get into our YouTube channel and watch it at a later time. So we are all interested in the world's largest round barn here. We all have our own memories of that. It's a very iconic part of Marshfield. And one of our speakers tonight is Don Felhofer, and he is the grandson of Frank Felhofer. And Frank was the original designer and builder of the barn. And our other speaker is Bob Lewerenz, and he was the person who designed the concrete replacement plans for the restoration work of the barn. And Bob has worked for a home center and a general contractor's office for almost 35 years. And then he started Bestimate LLC to continue estimating, drafting, managing construction projects on a freelance basis for the past 13 years. So we are looking forward to this timely presentation tonight as Wood County's Central Wisconsin State Fair is coming up August 23rd through the 28th. And that's when many of us, we remember our special connection with Marshfield's Big Red Barn. So I'm gonna let you guys take it away.
Okay, well, I'm Bob, and my interest in this great old unique round barn that's on the Central Wisconsin State Fairgrounds started in 2015 when the city of Marshfield hired me to draw bidding plans and paperwork to replace something like 60% of the concrete that was original concrete from 1916 that was in pretty bad shape. And I spent a lot of time learning about the barn and measuring and taking pictures to draw the plans. And I got interested. So I read the history, the Marshfield story, and which had a lot of information on the round barn. And there was other things that has information, and learned how it came to be and who designed it and who built it. And I've got to remember to switch slides here. A little help. Thanks. Okay, the round barn exists because the Central Wisconsin Holstein Breeders Association wanted to have a show and sales barn. And they invested in it with other breeders associations, the Central Wisconsin State Fair Association, Wood County Bankers Association, and private people. So why is it a round barn? People thought that round barns were wind resistant, and they were in favor at the time. They usually had a silo. They had feed storage in the center, so it was easy to feed them. It was hard to get manure out, and I think the economics of labor and materials weren't a problem at that time. This barn was designed around the center show and sales ring, so it was different. And at one time, it had bleacher seating for about 1,000 people. There was still is 2 outer rings of stalls for about 250 cows. If you look at the one picture shows bleacher seating that I think I vaguely remember when I was little, some of it was still there, but it's long gone. And the lower picture shows stanchions that were in use. So that's an old picture that because the stanchions are long gone, replaced by tie stalls. But that's a very original picture, and it has round mangers and manure gutter, things that aren't there anymore. The barn was designed and built by Frank A. Felhofer, who owned Felker Brothers Construction, and Frank drew the blueprints. His carpenters were Frank and his brothers, John, Fred, and Henry. And then when they needed more, Charles, William, and Edward were brothers that helped too. Don will talk more about the family, but I want to show you the plans. This is a floor plan that shows the layout of the stalls and all the 8x8 posts. They're a little hard to see here, but the little dots are 8x8 square wood posts that hold up most of the building. There's a lot of them. This is a cross-section view, which is a kind of a big deal because later you'll see pictures of round beams that they built. And the round beams are all sitting on a tall wood column, an 8x8 wood column. And that angle brace that you see going up to the highest, next to the highest ring beam, is a real big deal in keeping the structure from moving. It's pretty ingenious. And this is the concrete cross section. You can see that the gutters had rounded bottoms. Not the mangers had rounded bottoms, and there was manure gutters behind the cows, which doesn't exist anymore. But that's what they did at that time. So, and now Donna's going to take over and talk about the Felhofer family.
Well, I'm Donald Andrew Felhofer. My grandpa gave me the Andrew part, so I have to carry that on. I was born in 1950. I was raised, educated, and worked in Marshfield all my life. I'm now retired. I married Karen, my beautiful and intelligent wife, 42 years ago. Together, we have two sons, Brian Frank Felhofer and John Felhofer. We have 5 grandsons, Chase, Evan, Nolan, Owen, and Otto. I guess the Felhofer name will live on. I'm gonna talk about the ancestry. I am the great grandson of Frank A. Felhofer Sr. He is. I gotta go back here. This is Frank Felhofer Sr. And he was born in 1857, and he was 63 years old when he died. He married Marie Mayer, and they're both from Germany. They had 11 children. 3 of them died in infancy, and they moved. They had the first child was Charles. This is Charles in Germany, and then they moved to the United States in May of 1883, and they farmed, and the farm is still in existence. It's out on south of town on Double E. It would be east of A and on the north side. The other kids down here in order, this is Frank, and then Fred, and this was, they called her Aunt Tanta Mary, Aunt Tanta, and this is Fred. No, this is Henry and John. This is Ed or William, and Ed is over here. A lot of kids to remember. The main crew was Frank and John and Fred and Hank. Hank was the foreman of the crew, and if they had a bigger job, the other 3 would come and help. But most of them worked on the farm. Now, Charles was, like I said, was born in Germany in 1882, and he was only 36 when he died. He died of the Spanish flu in 1918. So he was one of the first victims of the Spanish flu. They had 5 children: Carol, Margaret, Joseph, Anne Marie, and then a boy, infant boy, who died. But you should remember that Joe Felhofer started the Rems Funeral Home with John Rems. He was the director for many years in the 1950s. And they later sold it to Cunningers in 1974. I guess they sold it for like $100,000. It seems small nowadays, but he ran that for a long time. We don't have much on Marie Weber Felhofer. She was 78 when she died. She was the second born. She married Michael Weber, and they had no children. Third born now is Frank Andrew Felhofer Jr. Yeah, this is Frank, and this is their wedding picture. Well, this actually is, I'm going to talk about, he was married twice. His first wife was Josephine Pancratz. They were married February 17th, 1914. They had a baby, Joseph, in 1915, who passed away. They tried for another child in 1916, and this baby also died. And Josephine, at the age of 26, 2 weeks later, she died. And in her last weeks of life, she needed care. She needed, of course, they wouldn't put you in the hospital, you stayed at home. So they hired someone to come and look after her for her last few weeks. And the person they hired was Rose Wenzel. And as it turned out, this is Rose Wenzel now. Frank married Rose Wenzel in August of 2016. They had 6 children. We get to it. There it is. This is my father, Richard or Dick Felhofer. This is Bob Felhofer. This is James. This is Maisie Felhofer Billings. Now Maisie, I got a little bit on Maisie here somewhere. She was a longtime Marshfield resident. She was back and forth, but she did work for a long time at the V&H in the finance department. She was a champion golfer and bowler. She had a daughter, Barb Billings, who also lived in Marshfield. She was a very good golfer and bowler. She was a principal at Columbus High School, and she passed away in 2011. Here's Frank. This is the youngest, Tom. Tom passed away last year, January of 2021, at the age of 87. He was the last of my uncles. And here's Rose, and back here is Arlene. You see Bob had 1 child. James had no children. Maisie had 5 children. 3 are still alive. Tom had no children. And Arlene had 3, and 2 are still alive. So I do have some cousins yet. Here's Maisie's obituary. Frank Jr. formed the construction company in 1905 with his brothers. The Felhofer Company built approximately 435 barns from 1910 to 1955. The Columbia Park Band Shell in 1931, the Merchants Exhibition Building at the Fairgrounds, M.J. Vandenhoff Garage, I.F. Diddle Building, East Side 4 Garage, Brick Barn at Norwood, the A&P Store, Dr. Dykeman Clinic, Neil Note Barber Shop, Northern Auto, the S.J. Miller Cold Storage. I think Quick Trip sits there now. Leith Furniture Warehouse, the Smelter Sheet Metal Building, just to name a few. Frank had a bout with typhoid fever in 1924, which, as we know, that can be bad. Now, Richard, my father, he served in the Army during World War II. He served in the Marical Division in the Pacific. He married Charlotte Nelson, and they had 3 children, Judy, and myself, and Paul. Richard took over Felhofer Construction in 1956 when Grandpa retired. They did mostly remodeling jobs in the 70s, and he switched to a desk job because of his health. He did some design. He was a design engineer for heating company, so he needed to take it a little easier. The construction company itself, it ended about 1980. Some of the places they built, the 1013 Drive-In, Baltus Oil, the Patio Restaurant. He built many homes, and he specialized in gas stations, which were pretty popular. Those full service stations that checked your oil and cleaned your windows all the time. The third brother is John. He was born in 1888. He died, he was 80 years old. He married Elizabeth Merkel, and he farmed mostly, except when they were building. He had 6 children: Doris, Betty Jane, Eugene, Violet, Norbert, and Irene. He was a veteran of World War I. Norbert Felhofer married Phyllis, and they had 4 children: John, Jane, Cooper, Julie, and James. He was an accountant for V&H. Now, many of you know Violet Felhofer, but her last name was Wenzel after she got married. She married Harry Wenzel from the Wenzel farm. She was a longtime resident, and they had 3 children: Russell, Judy, and Nancy. She was involved in the operation of that business until it was sold in 2014. Her legacy includes the Wenzel Family Plaza on Chestnut Avenue in downtown Marshfield. Fred was the 4th brother, the 5th child. He was only 45 years old when he died. He was married in 1917. They had 1 child, Virginia. And Henry, or Hank, that most people call him, was one of the brothers that I knew better than most of them. There's a lot of them were gone before I was even born. Yeah, he was also, this is a picture of him from World War I in France. He was a private first class. He worked on the farm also, but he was the foreman. He was the main, he oversaw the building of 300 of those homes and barns in the career. He married Ann Altman in 1923. They had 2 children, Germaine Pedersen and Carmen Reese. He was the last of the living Felhofer brothers. He helped organize the VFW in 1930. Since Memorial Day 1930, until his passing, he supervised the placing of flags on the graves of all veterans, which was pretty special. William Felhofer, or Bill. He was born in 1897 and died in 1966 at the age of 69. He married Grace McCabe. She was born in 1896 and she was 74 when she died. They had 7 children: Wayne, Jean, Daryl, Gerald, William Terrence, and Sharon. Now, Gerald sometimes was called Jerry, and William Terrence was called Terry. And Sharon, if anybody's ever been to Jimmy's Cafe, was Mitzi, because Jean Felhofer married Gordon Wilcott. And that's Terry Felhofer was a long time Marshfield resident. He married Carroll Can, and he was also in the Army. He managed the Elks Club for many years, which was awful handy for me because when I was a boy, our house was right across the street from the library in the parking lot of the Elks Club. We lived in that house for till 1959. And Terry was the manager of the club, and me being 5 and 6 years old, it was easy to go over and knock on the door, and Uncle Terry would come out with a candy bar or something for me. So I was always over there pounding on the door. We also had the Clover Cream Dairy just on the other side of the street. For a dime, you could go over and get a biggest ice cream cone you could handle. The Bruns Pool Hall was across the alley. Not saying that my dad went to the Bruns and the Elks a lot, but if I was looking for them, that's where I'd find them. And it was awful handy having everything that close. I went to school as a youngster, kindergarten. I went to the old Lincoln School, which was actually, now it's the old firehouse. That's where the old Lincoln School was. That was within walking distance also. Grandpa lived another block down the road. So when he retired, we saw that picture. Go back to this picture. This picture of Grandpa here. This is how I remember him, with the pipe and Del Broadhagen's bar, which is Sonny Brown's now. That was his favorite hangout. He'd play sheephead, and he had that pipe, and he had a black finger because he tamped that tobacco. He had his can of half and half, and he'd fill that pipe and tamp it, and he'd be puffing that thing. That was Grandpa. As I recall, he didn't live many years past that time. Now, Jean Wilcott, like I said, she married Gordon in 1948. In 1960, they ran the Roundup Bar in Marshfield. In 1950, Jean began her association with the Central Wisconsin State Fair. She and her husband opened a popcorn stand. Soon after, they changed the stand to an ice cream nut bar. They ran that stand for 30 years. After Chip died, Jean was elected to the fair board. She served as vice president and president. She got the Round Barn placed on a National Register of Historic Buildings. In 1980, the descendants of F.A. Felhofer scraped and repainted the Round Barn. She also started the Barnyard Theater Family Entertainment Tent. Here's a picture of, in 1980, of us working on the barn. This is my dad, Richard. This is Jean Wilcott. This is Oop Esser. Trish Immerfall. This is Joe Felhofer and Gerald Felhofer and Daryl Felhofer. On the top here, there's a grandson of William. This is Scott Wilcott. And the handsome guy next to him, this is me. And you can see my arm is in a cast. I was in a stock car accident just a couple of weeks beforehand, but I still was there, and we still worked a long time, many hours, working on the barn, making it look good again. Wayne was in the Army, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Daryl was in the Army, Korea, and Vietnam. Gerald was a Marine in Korea. Like I said, Terry was in the Army. The last brother was Edward. He was actually born in 1900. He was 56 when he died, just when Grandpa retired. He was married. He had no children, but he worked on the farm for a few years. Here's a strange fact. He was a veteran of World War II. He was a private in the U.S. Army. Looking at the date, he was born in 1900 in World War II. He was actually 42 when he enlisted in the Army. So he must have wanted to get away from the farm. In 1927, he opened a battery and tire repair shop. So I guess he wasn't working on a farm then, but he worked with a partner, James Carney, was located in the Marshfield Oil Company building. So that's what the brothers did, and hopefully we filled in a few names that you probably heard of, and what they're doing, what they did back then, and what's going on. Now I'm just going to hit a few highlights of the round barn. Bob is going to elaborate a little bit more on it, but I'm just going to mention a few things about it. That it was started on Thanksgiving Day in 1915. It was completed in the spring of 1916, and the second floor was finished later. It's 150 feet in diameter, 70 feet tall. It had 250 stalls. It could shelter 1,000 people. It had wooden bleachers. They didn't use any scaffolding, and that was the secret that they saved all that money, why their bid was so low at $6,000. They used a horse-drawn slusher to haul concrete around. It was paid for by the Central Wisconsin State Fair Association and many private donations. The round barn was more wind resistant because the surfaces were curved. The walls were stronger because they used lineal strength, which is 20 times stronger than cross grain strength. The barn originally had a manure carrier, which consisted of a cable suspended from the rafters that held a bucket. The system didn't work so well, so today they still use a wheelbarrow and shovel. I think they sneak a bobcat in there once in a while. They used the wood they used was red and white oak, hemlock, and pine. 188,000 cedar shingles were used. The round barn was dedicated on May 10th and 11th, 1916. They sold 125 Holstein cattle that day. The second floor, after it was completed, was used to exhibit chickens and rabbits. There was also a bandstand on the second floor. It was a popular spot for barn dances. Later, it was declared unsafe for such events, and today it's used mostly for storage. In the 20s, the round barns fell out of favor because they were hard to add on to. You didn't have any ends to build off of, so they didn't like that. And with the invention of the barn cleaners, cleaning the barn became a problem. So they got away from the round barn. In 1938, the barn was reshingled and later repainted. In 1964, the interior of the barn was revamped, removing 2 of the staircases to the second floor to allow for more cattle. Like I said, in 1980, the descendants repainted the barn. 1997, the barn was added to the state and national register of historic places. On Wednesday, September 1st, 2016, the world's largest round barn was rededicated after a major overhaul to celebrate the round barn's 100th anniversary. On June 12th, 2020, the barn was vandalized. Damage was minimal. I never found out whether they caught anybody for it, but they just repaired it. On February 2nd of 2022, the city of Marshfield received $140,000 in grant monies to replace 79 windows in the round barn that had become in disrepair. The wood was rotting and the water was penetrating the building. So they got the money for the windows. I guess I'll turn it back to Bob now, and he'll continue with some of the details on construction.
I love construction and spent 40 plus years involved in construction, mostly in somebody's office, preferably my own office. And so the round barn is really interesting. It's one of a kind. As Don said, the excavating was actually done with the slushers, horse-drawn slushers, because the first thing they had to do was get the black dirt off and get it level. So they used these a slusher was like a wide pan that a horse would pull along. It would dig in and it'd skid all the black dirt all over to the side. And once they had that, the first job, and it was literally the first concrete job that Felhofers did, according to a history I read, that was to pour the round wall that surround the perimeter of the round barn, which was done on Thanksgiving Day in 1915. And they mixed all that concrete by hand. And then before the concrete, the building framing could begin, they poured all those, you see in the picture, a kind of a pyramid, which were the piers that the 8x8 posts sat on. And I didn't take the time to count them, but there's a lot of them. And the posts had to have a foundation. So they poured all of those. So I hope you all, when you go into the round barn and you go up in the center, into the center section, it's beautiful. It's a work of art to me because I appreciate, and I actually had a hammer in my hand in my life. And I appreciate that the labor and the beauty of that round framing and how the difficulty. Every board was cut with a handsaw, and lots of those cuts were miter cuts where there was an angle, and maybe some of them were an angle and then a compound angle. And that was by men who used a framing square to mark that with a pencil. And even if it was a compound angle where it was this angle and a second angle, and I don't know how well you can see that, but it's that pencil mark was something they followed that around that miter cut with a handsaw, and it took a carpenter to do that kind of thing, and they were. So it's different when you stand in that round barn and you actually look at that picture. Doesn't do it justice, but you look up and look at how much structure there is up there, and that every piece was cut by hand. And think about that. Then going back to the framing lumber is white oak and red oak. The white oak and red oak, though, is the 8x8 sawn square columns that hold up the two outside rings that hold up the roof. And I'll show you what I mean by outside rings a little further along. The the inner rows of poles, the inner rings of poles, were too long to saw out of one tree, and so they were excuse me, they were made out of 4 2x8s. That way they could nail them and they could stagger the splices. But no doubt the lumber was cut and sawed locally. And that picture is actually up there in a round barn the last time I was there, and it's that the building materials furnished by Connor, I think it says Retail Company. It's a little hard to read, but I think Connor Retail Company is apparently who provided the materials, and they were proud enough to put a sign up. So here you can see a picture past the stalls of the outside stud wall. That didn't need to be heavy timber because all the outside wall does is support the roof, the half of the roof on the outside, because the half of the roof, that section of roof from the stud wall to the first row of poles, half of that is on the outside wall, half of that load is on the row of poles. So it didn't really have that much, and none of the floor rested on the outside wall. It illustrates a little better, but you in some of the drawings, and we'll have in more of the pictures, but there were 4 rows of columns that went all the way around the building, and as it went to the center, and that's what supported all the roof load and eventually the second floor load, the building weight and the live load, which is snow and ice and anything movable that would have been on the second floor. And this picture is kind of neat because it shows, you can see some of the old stanchions. So this is a very original picture, and you can see the roof when you were out there by the stalls because the second floor wasn't there. So this picture is between 1916 and 1920, in that ballpark when that floor was put in. When you got, so the outside rows were solid squares. They took a log and sawed an 8x8 out of a oak or a red oak or white oak log. And that's not hard to do if it's, say, up to 20 feet, but when it gets 40 feet long, if you did do it, how do you keep it straight? So we went the interior rows, the long columns that you see way up there and in this picture are laminated, 4 2x8s nailed together, staggering the splices, and it's actually stronger than that. Is an engineering thing that laminated columns are stronger. The grains are turned different ways, and they're the length made that necessary. So now think about, you've got these exterior stud walls framed, and you're starting to stand all these 8x8 columns up, and there's a lot of them, and they've got to be straight. And so you picture these guys running bracing from column to column with their levels on the column all the time and plumb bobs, and then they're running braces down to stakes in the ground and braces right and left and inside to outside to try to get that all to stand straight. That in itself took a lot of time and was kind of quite a task. And I picture carpenters like this didn't settle for pretty good. They had to be straight. And I've known carpenters like this that were old guys when I was young, and they got it right before they started putting a roof on it. So once they got the columns set, and they could begin building the roof framing in the winter, they're working off of ladders, and they're starting to build staging where they ran plank across from the outside wall and over to the rows of columns, and they laid plank flat so they could walk on them and set up enough so they had some place to stand. But it's high, gets high after a while, and as they get further up, and it's slippery and it's cold because this is all winter. You think about that a little bit. There were no man lifts, no forklifts. They didn't have a crane, so that was all Armstrong and all climbing. These round ring beams are kind of a mystery and a work of art, because you can see that they're pretty big. If the round barn was 150 feet in diameter, I don't know the diameter of the next house, the second one in from the stud wall, but it's big. And I can't imagine them building that up in the air. I think they were going to build it on the ground and wrestle it up there somehow. I don't know that. Nobody seemed, I haven't read anything, but how'd they do it? To even make the ring beams, you do that by soaking the lumber in water, and then you clamp it and you nail it, and then you clamp it some more and you squeeze it and get it all the way around. And then the next ply, you stagger the splices so that it holds the splice in the next ply. And it was a pile of work, and it was in winter, and they were wet. And so wet gloves, and that had to be just a big task. There were a lot of monumental tasks involved in parts of this. As the ring beams got smaller, I think they went from 2x8s to 1x8s because the upper two rings are quite a bit smaller. We'll get to some pictures as you go up. And I mentioned those braces when we looked at the plans, but those angle braces that you see in this picture that went from the first row of poles up to the second from the top row of poles, it was an ingenious way to support and stabilize all the columns and the round ring beams. The ring beams actually sat on the post, but they were stabilized. And in some cases, when you get to the very top ring, not counting the cupola, it's actually the rafters, and the top of those angle braces is actually holding that ring beam in place. That had to be something. Even with staging, if they had the place to stand, to get that ring beam up there, balanced on all those angle braces that are several feet apart at the bottom. And I'm, all through this thing is how they do that, how they manage. Maybe they had 4 or 5 guys on the average day and 8, and they probably could get more help when they were doing something real big. But they didn't have the power equipment that the general contractor I work for with man lifts and forklifts and cranes and all the things that we have today. And they got it done. And this is a more difficult building. So the round ring beams were kind of quite a task and quite an ingenious way of going about this thing. You can see how where the windows are, the stud wall sits on a ring beam and holds up the next ring beam and holds the windows in that sidewall. It's how they do it. It was up high, and it was difficult construction. When you get way up there, I'm gonna see if you look. Here we go. If you look at where I put that pointer, that's the top end of those angle braces. There's no post because now you're inside the center circle above the show ring. So there's no post to hold that ring up. So when you look at that very top ring where I'm pointing at, well, let me see if I can get it there. Okay, there's an angle brace there and one here, and they go all the way around, and that's what's holding this ring up. This ring holds, oh, don't do that. Okay. That ring, the second last ring, is not held up by angle brace or posts, but all those rafters had to be put up. And I imagine that they had to be standing on staging because there was nothing else. And maybe building staging up in there a little bit because they were cutting the rafters from the big ring that I'm pointing at up to the little ring where the cupola sits. And there's no frame holding all of that up. So they had to have put up temporary staging to some extent, and to some extent, they were climbing around on that stuff. Just out in the world, it had to be fairly scary. And by that time, they're approaching the top of the cupola is 70 feet. So they were up 50, 60 feet high working on that. We know that there weren't any cranes because the history said there weren't. We don't know if they built the ring beams in place. I think that wouldn't have been something they did, but maybe they had staging where they had lots of room to work. Either way, getting those round ring beams up there would be a Herculean task. And maybe they got a lot of help, but that's an interesting part of the whole building. Way up in the center is a smaller ring beam, and the rafters hold it up. There's no other framing, and then the cupola was built on the ground, according to the history book, and they wrestled that up. It isn't real big, so they did harder, much more difficult things than getting that cupola up there. I imagine they sided and shingled it after they had it up there, so to keep the weight down. But there's a lot of how did they do it in this whole building, and understanding, be involved in construction, you start picking that out. But if you go stand in this barn and look at all these pieces, you start thinking about it. There's a lot of mysteries here. So when you're at the fairgrounds, and go to the center of the round barn and look up, it's a work of art. And think about the men who were there on staging that they built as they went up, standing on planks, temporary. It wasn't going to be that solid. They couldn't have been that nervous of guys, and they were building ring by ring, no forklifts, in the winter, cold and slippery. It had snowed, it rained. It was quite a task, quite a thing to accomplish. When they shingled it, they cut the fingers off their gloves so that they could handle the nails. And which is, people do that today yet, because there were so many, 188,000 shingles. And I don't know, but I'm guessing at least 4 nails per shingle. And because wood shingles is, I don't know exactly how they nailed them, but at least 4. So it was 50-pound kegs or boxes of nails, one after another. The concrete floors and mangers were poured in the spring. The original mangers had a round bottom, and people that were showing cattle when I was there now didn't want anything to do with that, because they wanted to be able to get a shovel in that manger and shove all the leftover feed to one end and shovel it out of there, and then broom it down to the end. And round bottom didn't work very well at all, according to the people doing it nowadays that I actually talked to them. And when I was designing the concrete work for in 1915. And a little backstory that goes with that is, in 1915, all the remaining old concrete that had not already been replaced, which I think was about 60 or 65% of the concrete was old. That was to prepare for the Round Barn Centennial in 2016. And sometime before that, they had had somebody draw a set of plans and specifications to paint the round barn, and also to in a separate project, they had it reshingled, and it had been asphalt shingles for a long time, and that was again with asphalt shingles. And something that other people that I ran into was they gave me a set of plans from the licensed architect that drew the plans to have the round barn painted. And I went through them, and it said that the round barn was 170 feet in diameter. But I knew the history said it was 150 feet in diameter. I checked that history book again, and I said, I don't think it's, well, who's right? So I went over to the round barn and pounded a stake in the center of that circle and pulled my 100-foot tape out, and it was 75 feet. So it is 150 feet in diameter, and I proved it. And this guy took pretty good money from the city, because architects are now $150 an hour. And that's big money in my world. And he wasn't even close to right. I was pretty disgusted with that. I still am disgusted with that, because if you're gonna do a job, you should do it right. So anyway, the bottom picture there is a manger that was done by 2016 in the project that I dealt with, and it has a flat bottom. It's a lot more difficult. That, I guess it's common sense that it's a lot more difficult doing round mangers and all that forming. It was a big deal forming that. You couldn't just use standard forms. They had to use short sections and come around, and a lot of stakes. Another thing is that the old barns always had manure gutters, but the people showing cows now don't want manure gutters because there's no manure in them barns. What I mean is, when a cow dumps, first of all, there's a lot of straw. They bed it heavily, but there's one of them kids is right there with a shovel throwing it in a wheelbarrow, and before there's much in that wheelbarrow, it's out the door, and they keep it so clean. That picture is when the concrete was brand new, but after the fair and after they get it all done and the skid steer's been through, excuse me, and they're done sweeping, or I bet even right now you go look and it doesn't look that much different. They keep it real clean in there. Box stalls were in the closest ring to the show arena, and they were metal pens, as you can see, for the small animals, calves and maybe sheep and goats and stuff like that. And the modern guys, they had curbs under. You can see a concrete curb under the pen panels. Well, that was fine when you were cleaning it with a shovel to push the manure up against and get your shovel full. But if you're trying to use a machine, they're just in the way. So there are none of those. And most of those panels are gone, except as you get to the hallway where you go into the center circle, so that they can use the skid steer, and it's much easier for cleaning. But that's how an old barn, back in the day, that's how they were. The second floor is interesting. There's a few different histories and news articles about what year it was, but the most likely one says in 1920, I think the Breeders Association and some other, they put up the money to put that second floor in. And if you remember, those posts that we looked at in the pictures are 8x8s, and they were straight up and down. And so now you're going to try to support beams. And if you look at Well, what I call dovetails, and I can't seem to quite get my pointer to land on it. But you can see on that post, there are blocks of wood cut into the post under the beams that run horizontally. And those blocks aren't there in the old pictures where there was no floor, and there were no notches. So probably we're talking 1920 with hand tools. Somebody cut an angle into that notch, into that 8x8 column, and they cut it in such a way that they didn't go all the way through that outside ply. When you look at them close, they go through quite a bit of it. But what they're doing is getting that wooden block that's angled to sit on the post, not hanging that second floor load on bolts or nails. They're actually bearing it on that wood post, and it carries all the way down to the ground. So it's the right way to do it. Trusting people's safety to hang it on nails is not something, that's not the right way to do it. Here they cut the beams that are horizontal carefully to go from post to post, so they were a nice tight fit, and they notched those blocks into the columns, and it's a very important thing to realize how much. There's a lot of posts and how much work it would have been to cut all those notches, and probably took the wood out with a wood chisel. They spent a lot of time doing that. Another thing that's neat that I just noticed in this picture is that there's a sign, and I lost it again, but if you look at the top picture, at the top of the picture, it says designed and erected by F.A. Felhofer. And if you walk into the north door, the exposition building side of walk into the north door of the round barn, and F.A. Felhofer's sign that he put on there in 1915 or 16 is there. It's only at one door. I was pretty proud to put my sign next to it and to make my sign look something like theirs, because I was real proud of doing that project. And so I made my sign look like F.A. Felhofer's, but I got all four doors. So. And there you see the second floor as it looked when I was working on this project. And when I was little, I remember there being cages with chickens and rabbits up there. And way back, I don't remember it, but way back, early, right after it was new in 1920, they had barn dances, and that was something that went on for a long time. I don't know the story on who, why, or what condemned that second floor, but I do know that building codes have gotten more difficult. The loads that are to be carried for safety for people, which is something that I deal with, are heavier, and if it's not safe, it's a good thing they did it. But I don't know even who and when that was. Anyway, it's just a place for stuff right now. And all of this is why the world's largest round barn is a magnificent accomplishment. It's one of a kind and a work of art. And that's the way it looked in 2015. Yeah, that's all we got.
Now we look for questions. And questions.
And we're up for questions.
Here we got questions.
Any windows in now?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either.
I don't know. We'll see.
I was wondering how
We'll
they
see
did
in a
it.
couple of weeks when
I was wondering how they did it. If they did.
Well, I'm sure now they've got those telescoping man lifts.
They do.
Yeah, there was
So,
a
you
question
know, they
asked
can
whether
reach-
the windows were replaced in the barn yet, and no one really knows, and we'll have to look when the fair comes to town at the end of August and see if they are, or they should have been,
Mhm.
because they've had the money now.
Right.
Usually those things are done by the fair, so it probably is.
My question,
Yes.
how much would you estimate it would cost to build a barn like that today from scratch?
I have no clue. I don't think anybody would put the effort out because it's just, nobody's ever gonna do that again. The cost of material is one thing, material is nice, but the labor is,
There was a question asked, how much would it cost to build a round barn at today's cost? And I know I read it in the Times. They had an article in it just this week, and they did give a number, and I can't remember the exact number, how many dollars it would have costed to build it today. So we have to look back.
in the Times,
City.
City Times. Oh, okay.
Hub City Times.
I think they're very, is that original, that?
The cupola? The cupola is original. It was talked about in the history that they put that up there when they were finished.
Is this the only round barn this size in the state of Wisconsin?
Well, it's the biggest one, but I think there are other round barns. When you read up on it, it'll talk about, if you go on the internet and read about round barns, it'll talk about at least one other, but I think there's more than one.
Yeah. There's a whole, we took a tour down there. You can get a tour off of the internet, and they're all numbered and directions on how to get to them. And there's
There is no real record book that keeps track of the world's largest round barn. They just have the name, and it's not in the book like Guinness Book of Records or anything, but it's their claim. So Marshfield has the world's largest round barn.
We have a couple of online questions too, if you don't mind me interrupting here.
There's
Brian Felhofer asked two questions. First of all, he says, great presentation, well done. Did the Felhofer brothers exclusively build round barns, or did they also build traditional barns?
They built many barns. Most of them were traditional barns. As far as I know, this was the only round barn they built.
Okay.
They built over 400 barns, so
Wow.
they had a lot of experience.
He also asked, do you know if the lumber was milled near Marshfield, or did it come from somewhere else in the state?
I'm sure it was milled near Marshfield. There was Connor Lumber and other places. It was bought at a supply store that we had. Said the lumber was supplied by
Connor Retail.
Connor Retail. So I'm guessing that there were plenty of places in this area that did the milling of the logs.
Okay.
Connor had sawed logs in Auburndale for a long time way back.
You know, if they had Menards there, you could have gotten your 11%.
Oh, was it still going then? Yes.
When you mentioned the pens that were around the center ring, they weren't necessarily made for the little calves. They had bulls. They used to show bulls at the fair, and those pens were for the bulls because they were big and bulky, and they had to have them in a bigger pen. Instead of the little calves, they had bulls in them.
You know, I remember seeing big bulls in there too,
Yeah.
come to think of it.
You have to repeat the question.
A lady in the audience said that that the pens were really used for huge, big Holstein bulls. And I guess I remember seeing them when I was a little kid, and the pens are still there. But the history said small animals. But I think you're right. But I think I remember, and of course, you know, how well.
Remember at time. So it's a few years back, but
Okay. And yeah, 4-H remember.
There were large bulls in
Oh, yeah.
there, because I showed cattle on that center ring on 4-H back in the 50s. And that was certainly the case back then.
That was probably a safety thing.
yeah, it was.
Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Many years ago, I think this article was back in the 70s or 80s that I read about the building of the round barn. And so I'm just trying to remember all those years ago that it said that they didn't have any plans of how to do it. They kind of just, had an idea in their head and they did it without any plans, if I remember right.
Repeat the question.
I'm gonna buzz back because Frank Felhofer did have plans. There's actually copies of them at the Upper Mansion. And I ended up getting a set because I was just so interested in it. And they're in this presentation, if I can buzz back far enough, and I'll be there in a minute. But they're to me, they're kind of works of art. They're not that they're art, but this guy somewhere around 1915, 1916 is sitting there, and he draws this page is the 150-foot layout, and there's not a whole lot to go on it, but there are various pages that are similar that have dimensions on it.
So wasn't that they had never built one before? This was
That's
one, and he didn't know how to do it or whatever, and he just figured it all out in his mind.
I'm sure that's true because it was their first and only. And like this next page that Frank drew, I've spent my life drawing plans and dealing with buildings, and there isn't a lot of notes there, but it's ingenious how the columns in circles held up these round beams, and that brace that's up at an angle braces the rows of columns and then actually holds up the very top ring that's at the end of that angle brace. I'm sure he figured this all out in his head, and this is just a very small amount of plans for that complicated construction. So I think there is plans, but if somebody was going to build that, if an architect was drawing plans for it today, it'd probably be 40 pages. Because I handle a lot of those, and they really and a story I believe I lived the story both in bidding projects in the past and a little bit when I drew projects and put them out for bids. And this wasn't true of me, but architects and engineers, like the people who drew the plans for this building, want to do it on a contract for a percentage of the gross cost of the building. It used to be 6%, now it's 7% plus.
Your attention, please. The library will be closing in 20 minutes. All of today's meeting room reservations are now expiring. If you're using one of our meeting rooms, please gather your things and exit the room. If you have materials you would like to borrow, please check them out now. The library will be closing in 20 minutes. Thank you.
Anyway, to finish the story, so 7% of this building, which was round figure 7 million, if I remember right, is $500,000. So they're going to generate a spec book that thick, and they literally do, and it might be thicker, and they'll have 40, 50, 60 pages of plans, and it'll be big sheets, and it'll be that thick, and that they have to generate that kind of paperwork to charge that kind of money. And I've dealt with it all my life, and it's fair, and yet the problem is when a building is taken on a contract like that, and that's how every government and big buildings are generally done, is that once an engineer or an architect has that contract, there's no incentive to do anything in a more in a lower cost way. They're to save you money doesn't that cuts their 7% down to a smaller amount. I'm sure I'm not picking on them because that's how they live and that's how the system works, and it's not their fault that they didn't think it up themselves. But so I always make the joke that on the first day of engineer school, they tell you, if you only remember this, remember that 6% of a million is more than 6% of 500,000. And that's the kind of thing that contractors and builders and architects, that's what we deal with in our lives. I think I got to an answer to your question, but there actually are plans, but they're first he had to figure it all out in his head, and there's a lot more thinking involved. And then he took this little bit, and this is really very, very minimal. And there's the concrete, very minimal. And then as they did it, there was a lot of head scratching, talking between themselves, figuring out how they're going to fasten things. It's very interesting, complex.
Fair Association has insurance, quote, unquote, on the buildings in the fairgrounds. Is there any kind of a value of this building? I mean, $500,000 or to replace it, or, I mean, there must be some.
The question is, again, what the replacement cost of that building might be. And I can't answer that. They certainly must have insurance. Can, do they? We'd have to ask them.
Yeah.
And who set a cost on that? Somebody would spend a great deal of time figuring out the value of that, of that material, and then trying to figure out how many hours of labor would be involved, and then all the concrete work. And I used to do that for a living. It'd be a task to do it. It's doable. Somebody has probably figured it out. And the other thing is there's more than one. There's computer programs now, and there's also a book of estimating sections that the name won't pop into my head, but they may use that book to find so much for an embedded post, so much for a concrete pier, so much per square foot for flat concrete. That's in a book that I used to use. I don't remember the name of it.
You feel that the Fair Association is maintaining the round barn because of its value?
It would be like not taking care of the biggest diamond ring in the world. There's only one. So I think they're doing a great job because yeah, well, but I mean, before I was involved in the concrete, they had it painted, they re-shingled it. The windows now, I think they're doing a great job, and it would be pretty awful to let it go to ruin. You can't replace it. Nobody's ever going to rebuild something like that. If it did have a fire, God forbid, it's just not going to happen. Just a thought is that 2 years ago, I did plans for a show barn at the fairgrounds in Nilsville for the Clark County Fair. And it's 130 wide by 213 feet long. It's about 36 feet tall. And it's a big post frame barn with the walls go up and then up to a section roof, and then there's a clerestory with light panels in it, and then a center roof. It's pretty beautiful, and that was $1 million deal, and it's buildable. In today's world, the material and labor made sense. You could do it for $1 million. I don't think you could do the round barn for $1 million. I don't think that would. There's too many pieces to put together. Even cut them with power tools and using lifts. I think $1 million wouldn't put it up. I don't think anybody's ever going to do that again.
Very nice presentation.
I have another question online. Brian also asks, he says those plans are beautiful looking. Are there copies online anywhere but Upham? Do you guys know of that?
Sounds like no.
They're not online. The only, you can get them when this program is recorded, so you can see more pictures of them. The original copies were donated to the Upham Mansion. So they are there. If you're in Marshfield, we can take you there and you can look at them. Touch the real plans, but I know these are hard to see, but there are real copies of them existing.
Okay. I want to thank all of you. Don and Bob, you did a wonderful job. I have a whole new respect for the architecture of that round barn, definitely. I also want to thank Bill Haas for bringing in that replica of the round barn. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Our next Spoken History will be Thursday, September 8th, and it will be on Etched in Stone, Understanding the Symbols Used on Old Gravestones. And the presenter will be Dennis Jacobs, and he comes to us from the Brown County Library Association. So thank you so much, you guys. It was very wonderful.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.